board. So I sent you guys a bunch of links in the chat window for Zoom. I realize that you three are not on the chat window of Zoom, which would make this difficult. So I'm going to paste that in the email or the invite, so you should have those. Okay. Okay, all right, so let's see, share screen. Okay, let me know, can everyone see the screen who's on the call?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we're gonna start, oh, geez. So today what we're gonna try and do is, I'm gonna give you guys a brief overview of what evidence synthesis is in its many different forms and why we use it. And so what are the benefits of doing it over a traditional literature review? And so there's some key points to keep in mind when you're going through it. And then we'll start covering some of the beginning steps of what an evidence synthesis protocol and process entails, and where you need to be very clear and keep an eye out for your methodology. So I sent you guys a bunch of resources. Certainly don't expect that everyone read everything. There were a lot of things there in the calendar invite, but these are really good resources to keep in mind when you start doing this and start going down the line. You know, certainly looking at the guidelines from the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence are a good place to go back. Not everyone is going to be doing a systematic review or a systematic map. So I think we've got some thematic reviews in the room. We've got some scoping reviews. Sarah, I think that's sort of where you're going to end up, and then you guys are doing a systematic map. So depending on what your review sort of bubble is, what your review questions are, the methods that you choose are going to depend on that. So we'll go through sort of where we'll need to keep an eye out for modifications and et cetera. And then, so we're going to go over how to create your review protocol. So being very clear about what your review entails, what are the components of the review, and then having that protocol document written, sort of a living document amongst your review team to keep everyone on the same page. And then we'll end with constructing search strings and starting to develop that and identifying your search sources. And so I think, since I just allocated 2 hours for this, I really think that's probably all we're going to get to. And then we can, as people go along in reviews over the summer, we can do another session where we start looking at the screening process and also developing your data extraction. So what kind of information are we drawing out from these papers that you're going to get in your review. All right, so let me play this. Okay. So I'll be honest, this is a wholesale borrow from the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence training materials. So you'll see a lot of that symbol there. So let me just go through all that. So where systematic reviewing came from is that people are publishing more and more scientific data and publications, right? So they're out there, and this is great. This is a really big resource for us to be able to draw information from, but everyone does studies in different ways, and everyone samples in different ways. Everyone conducts their analysis in different ways. And so the range of different types of study quality and study design and the reliability of the data is going to vary. So we can't just look at, say, one paper or another paper, one study or another study, to say, oh, this is evidence to prove that this type of action is effective for achieving these types of outcomes. Particularly when we're trying to use this evidence to make decisions, we need to consider the whole body of evidence out there and have a really transparent and robust way in which we can assess what's the reliability of the evidence base as a whole and what does that tell us. As well as some of that data is more accessible than others. Some stuff is going to be in open access journals. Other things are going to be behind paywalls, that you can access maybe with an institutional subscription, maybe you can't. And then some things are going to be valid sources of information, for example, reports, planning documents, stuff from what we call the gray literature that's hiding out in databases and organization websites that you have to sort of dig through and look through. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why there's a picture of a skeleton looking at a book, to be quite honest. But this is the example. I mean, I like to use this example because it's quite sort of, I think, fitting for why we do this. We know that all these different types of actions, these programs are happening out there, and people are spending millions, if not billions of dollars in funding these programs. But the insights that we get from those programs tend to be buried somewhere where maybe we're not reading it. So they looked at the World Bank's database and they saw that, I think it was a third of their reports had never been downloaded after they've been uploaded to this database. So someone produced this report. I produce reports for a World Bank. Please hope someone's reading those. But you produce this report, and then what happens to it? It goes into this database, and someone might access it, someone might read it. And found it was people are actually not even reading it. Or if they had been downloaded, no one really knows if someone had opened it and then used it in some way. So in order to try and harness all the wealth of information that's out there, and to pursue more evidence-based decision-making, we need to have a way to do this collaboratively so that we can capture what is the best available evidence that's out there that to answer these types of questions. But not only do we need to capture that information, we need to do it in a very transparent and very robust and very unbiased way, because we want to reflect the true state of the evidence. We don't want to cherry pick evidence to prove, say, a question or an answer that we want to see. And we also want that information to be used, right? So if we conduct a review and it's actually answering a question that no one actually has, or no one's interested in, is that review even useful, or is that synthesis even useful? So we need to do it in a way that's quite collaborative and iterative, that reflects the needs of whoever the decision makers we're seeking to inform. So these systematic evidence syntheses, they come in different forms, but they all try and seek to answer what is the evidence, or what is the state of evidence for the impact or the effectiveness of doing X or a set of X actions on Y, or a set of Y outcomes. So we're looking for evidence of impact. And so you can get these syntheses in different forms. They can either be figurative, where you're trying to understand what's the distribution and the volume, so the quantity of evidence that's out there. So you're mapping out where evidence exists and where it does not exist in some sort of framework that's relevant to your users. And then the second is aggregative. So this is where you're going into the studies themselves that are within your synthesis and trying to combine insights from the different outcomes. So say we're trying to understand what's the impact of protected areas on reducing biodiversity loss. If we want to get a quantitative number from that, we would then need to go into those papers and start to aggregate that data and combine it in a way that allows us to conduct analyses and make statements about the general pattern of impact that we see. So you're combining these outcomes using meta-analyses, using different types of qualitative or quantitative synthesis to get at that. So there are two main forms. I'm going to probably focus a little more on systematic mapping, because I think most of you guys will be working on that. For the Duke folks, so you guys are conducting an evidence gap map, which is very similar to a systematic map. And Willa and Gabby, I think, are familiar with this as we've sort of gone back and forth. Because there are different types of synthesis methods out there, people decide to put different levels of rigor on them, or they choose to configure their syntheses in a way to better reflect what their needs are. So for an evidence gap map, this is a method that's defined by the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, 3IE. And so they consider evidence gap maps to be essentially a systematic map, but that uses a very robust level of evidence. So they won't take any studies that don't employ a valid comparator. So for example, they're only going to take randomized control trials, impact evaluations, systematic reviews, and systematic maps, I think. Whereas a systematic map, by definition, can include a broader space of evidence. So for example, if you wanted to include case studies, you could, but it's all dependent on how you define your review, and what caveats and what limitations you'll have if you include or exclude different types of information. Okay, so going back up now, Before I delve into systematic maps, does anyone have questions? No? I actually can't really see you guys, so if I hear silence, I will just assume no questions. Okay, cool. All right. So what a systematic map is that's trying to collate, so trying to gather together all the available evidence relevant to a question and then code that information and then configure it in a way that starts to identify what's a state and distribution of evidence. So both systematic maps and systematic reviews are going to use a predefined protocol that details methodology in order to minimize bias. So you can run that by other people and say, are we doing this right? Have we captured the full scale of information? Or are we missing a whole section or whole concept? And then what systematic maps are really useful for is indicating where do we have a lot of knowledge and where do we not have enough knowledge. So identifying where there are knowledge gluts and knowledge gaps to help inform where do we go to do further research and synthesis, but also where do we have some gaps in knowledge, whether I go back in and look at the theory that underlies that particular area where we're missing knowledge, or try and understand, is this even a place where we think there should be information? So in terms of policy and practice, these systematic maps, these evidence maps, create a thematic collection of information, and then they visualize it as a graphic that maps this distribution and occurrence over a policy relevant framework of these types of actions that we're interested in and the outcomes we think they can achieve. So an example of that, shameless self-promotion, this is a paper we did a number of years ago looking at what's the state of evidence on the effects of nature-based conservation. So you see that along the top on the x-axis on different domains of human well-being. So by trawling through the literature, we were then able to categorize each of these studies into what it was trying to examine, the impact of what type of conservation intervention and what types of human well-being outcomes. And so this is a way to then visually represent the distribution of information and where you see there are knowledge gluts, where there are dark green spots, and then knowledge gaps, these lighter yellow and white spots. Okay, so that's a systematic map. So your systematic review is where you start to dive more deeply into the questions of direction of impact. So with the systematic map, you typically don't look at whether or not outcomes are positive or negative or neutral or whichever. Because in order to do that, you need to be able to critically appraise the quality of the evidence for that direction of impact and then the magnitude of that impact. So let me go to the next one here. Maximize coverage. Okay. So if you think about it this way, where your systematic map is this approach that allows you to see what the landscape looks like. So when you look at the ocean, you have no idea what's down there. The systematic map allows you to see, where are the peaks and where are the trials, this sort of the symmetry map. And then your systematic review is when you can actually do that deep dive and start to understand what's the magnitude and the quality of evidence that says that something is effective for achieving impact on specific outcomes. And what this allows you to do is conduct more thorough and unbiased investigations of what are these pathways to impact and what's the scale of impact. So people have done all sorts of reviews on these topics, all sorts of reviews on different topics. So the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence looks to set the guidelines for systematic evidence synthesis methods in environmental management and in conservation. So these are some that have come out looking at importance for nature for health, the biological effectiveness of marine protected areas, evidence about glacier melt across the Himalayas. So you can see they vary in sort of the scale and the topic area that they're examining. So I would encourage you guys to go to the CEE website. I should have put the website down there, but it's environmentalevidence.org. And we publish a journal that is open access that publishes protocols and final syntheses of different types of evidence synthesis. And these are all peer-reviewed. And we also publish guidelines. So the most recent set of guidelines is now online to provide information about what are the accepted and rigorous methodologies for doing these types of reviews, as well as there's a database on there for all the reviews that have been published through the journal. And we're also starting a new tool and database called CEDAR. That's a repository of all reviews, so not just the systematic evidence synthesis reviews, but all reviews on environmental management and conservation topics that are then ranked for their reliability. It's a massive undertaking, but we're hoping by the end of this year it'll be there. So you can see sort of when you look at a review, you can possibly go to this database and say, how reliable is this? What should I be concerned about? Is it actually cherry picking results? Is it only focused on one small section of the literature and it's missing a lot of other things? So that will be out there sort of as a future reference as you guys continue in on your work and studies beyond your projects. So then I'll just briefly sort of bring this up as illustrating what the difference in the process of doing this is. So what's shared amongst all evidence syntheses, I'm just illustrating here systematic reviews and systematic maps. So all of these processes are going to involve very clear question formulation. They're going to be clear protocol development, so establishing your methods before you start. And then you're going to do a set of search terms that you're going to test and to do your searching. You're going to screen your articles, typically in a team. You're going to extract data from them. And then what they start to differ is after data extraction. So in a systematic review, you're trying to document impact, right? You're trying to measure that impact. So you'll need to do critical appraisal of articles. So how reliable are individual articles based on their study design, sampling, et cetera, to put any weight behind the findings that you've reported. For systematic mapping, you're actually just going to map the data. So you're sort of thematically categorizing the information in the article. So for example, categorizing it by intervention, by outcome, by comparator, study design, et cetera. So you're sort of putting the papers in different buckets. And then with systematic reviews, after you've done your critical appraisal, you actually need to synthesize the data. So by conducting some sort of meta-analysis or qualitative thematic analysis, depending on what kind of data you have, or doing some sort of mixed methods. And then you come back in, and both of these methods are going to then review their findings, talk about what's the patterns in the data, what does that tell us about certain practices or policies or pathways to impact, and then you publish them and you disseminate them in whichever way you feel is most effective. Okay, so today we're going to talk about just the first three, the question formulation, the protocol development, and then the searching. And hopefully this is hitting all of you guys at the point where you are at in your project. So it's the beginning of really refining the questions and then starting to develop the protocol. And I know with some of you guys who are working with me, we've kind of talked about what the questions are already. And we've started to hone in on what we need to do to develop that protocol. So hopefully this will be a good chance for us all to sit down and do this. Okay, so part of the things we're going to do today, it'll be a bit hands-on, and we're going to use a tool called Colander. So if you haven't signed up for a Colander account already, let me know, and maybe you can sign up now. If you haven't received a confirmation email after you signed up, also let me know, because sometimes they get stuck, and I'll need to manually add you to the system. But what Colander allows you to do, and I'll pull it up here, is it's going to allow you to set up your review and do the review planning. So developing sort of the parameters of your protocol. Okay, so you can see the screen here. This is very confusing. Okay, so if you've already signed in, if you have an account, you can sign in. Otherwise, you can sign up, put your name, your email, and a set of password. Do not forget your password, because I cannot look it up for you. You'll just have to click forget password. What is my password? Okay. All right. So Calendar is a free and it's an open access app for facilitating the evidence synthesis process. It allows you to do review planning. Let me just, what's a good one? Let me fill this out. Okay, so yeah, so when you set up a review, it allows you to do some planning. So for the steps we were just talking about, what's the objective of your review, the questions, setting up your search string, and then allows you to screen through all those articles that you find and indicate which ones are relevant and which ones are not relevant and extract data. And what's cool about Calendar is we built it with machine learning so that when instead of, say, sort of manually trawling through 10,000 search results, as you trawl through, it will learn what's most relevant to you, and it will start popping that stuff up to the top and pushing stuff that's more relevant as you're screening through things to the bottom. And then when you're doing the data extraction, it will also do some predictive modeling of what categories it thinks your paper is going to fall in based on what you've defined. So we'll get to that at some point later. But what I would like you guys to do is at least sign up for now. And if you have not, I think for the sake of learning all the steps, everyone just set up their own review. I know some of you guys have reviews that you set up with me, or you have maybe a shared one that you guys are all doing together for the Oceans Evidence Gap Map. But for the sake of learning the method and familiarizing yourself, I would just set up a new review, and we can just start from there. So people on the phone, do you guys have any questions before we move on? Does everyone have an account?
No questions here. Yes, I have an account.
Okay. And do you guys have an account already? Okay, you guys are all good. Okay, cool. So this two screen thing is like very throwing me off a bit here. All right, let me just. All right. Okay. The next part. Okay, so we'll do the next part. I'm going to take a water break. So just 2 minutes. There's some snacks. People in the room. If you guys want snacks, there's some dip. I bought a healthy dip. I need water. There might be some washable ones. Okay. You guys are so neat. I would just stick my hands in. Okay. That's what I'm going to do now. You should come to yourself. Well, while we take a very brief break, how's everyone's summer going? People on the phone?
Great.
Sorry, it's just your voice is just like bounding out of my computer. All right. Cool. All right. Now there's just crunching. I should have bought less noisy snacks. I did actually think about buying a watermelon and realizing that we would just have a watermelon with no way of cutting it. Okay, when the rustling ones stop, I will start. Okay, so this is probably, sorry guys, it's Friday. My brain's getting a little bit mushy. So this probably, I would say, is one of the most important parts of the synthesis process. So you can review knowledge all you want, all right? But I'm really being clear about what the question is and who is going to be using the insight from your review. So, systematic synthesis is rarely used because we feel like it, right? So there's always an intention that the review is intended to inform some sort of practice, whether it's research prioritization, whether it's policy, whether it's the way we make decisions and how we make decisions. So as a critical part of that, in formulating a question, the stakeholders are very important, whoever those stakeholders are. So there's a first step of identifying who are your stakeholders, but then there's a second part of involving those stakeholders in a meaningful way of formulating that question. Fairly certain I just did this, but right. So, first identifying a question that's of interest. But then the second is also ensuring that the question that you've identified is actually specific enough that you can answer it. So, if we said that we're going to do a review of what is the meaning of life? It's not specific enough that it would be answerable because the topic area is so broad. Not to say that broad questions cannot be addressed with some type of synthesis, but they do need to be sufficiently specific that you can draw some bounds around what you're looking for and what's included and not. But one of the most critical parts of that is that the broader the questioner gets, the more expensive it's going to get, because the main cost and burden of doing a review is the time that it takes and the resources that's required. So, in doing a review, you don't necessarily need materials. You need a computer, you need access to a database to access those articles and a paywall, so that's one cost. But then it's really just people's time. So if you're going to be doing this, you really need to try and maximize the cost effectiveness. And then lastly, the more specific your question is, the less likely it is that somebody who's reading your review or the reviewers within the review team itself are going to be confused, and you're going to end up getting inconsistencies within your review, and also confusion in how to interpret your review or what it's about, because it's either vague in terms of its language and the definitions that are being used, or perhaps that the phrasing and the way that you've scoped it isn't appropriate to answer those questions. Okay. I think maybe focusing with 2 S's is how it's spelled in the UK, or not, or maybe it's just a typo. So these are some examples of how you can focus questions. So this question first came up: are protected areas effective in maintaining biodiversity and reducing habitat loss? So we can start to parse out. So, okay, the first part, when I look at this, I would say, okay, protected areas. What kind of protected areas? Where are they? All protected areas? Ones on land, ones in forests, and marine areas? Because those are definitely different types of protected areas. And then maintaining biodiversity. How are we measuring biodiversity? What scale of biodiversity? And then reducing habitat loss. How could that be construed? How are we looking at habitat loss? What counts as loss? Is there a threshold? So these are the types of questions that you can imagine that somebody who looks at your paper would read your question and say, okay, well, now I have this question. How would you answer it? And how do you narrow your review down in a way that allows you to really focus in on what you're trying to answer? So in this case, this was actually a review that Andrew Pullen, who is the director of CE, did some years back, where they narrowed it down to, okay, well, we're looking specifically at terrestrial protected areas, but interested in these broad biodiversity and habitat loss outcomes. So when you're working with stakeholders, just trying to get through all these, get them to display. Okay, so when you're working with stakeholders, this formulation process is going to be iterative. So you're starting with this broad problem. For example, we want to do something about, you know, I don't know why I'm blanking on a really large problem, climate change. It's a very broad problem, right? So then you can start to explore a number of different questions within that. You know, for example, okay, what's the effectiveness of alternative fuels for addressing climate change? And then what kind of climate change outcomes are you looking at? Or maybe someone's interested in what can cities do at a city scale to address climate change. So you can see, depending on the stakeholders you're working with, those questions are going to change, and you're going to have to go through that process with them to really try and understand what is going to be a suitable question for synthesis. And then going through that process, you can start to prioritize which questions are most critical for you to address in your review. And I think this is a process that's going to be particularly important for you guys doing the Oceans Evidence Gap Map, being able to consult with lots of people at WWF about what do they see as a problem, and what are the types of questions they're interested in understanding and gaining more knowledge on, since you guys will be mapping out what is the state of knowledge on marine conservation broadly, right? Okay. Just getting through. Okay, so as you start to formulate your question, you need to assess whether or not that question is suitable for either a systematic map or systematic review, or neither. So what is key here is trying to understand whether or not your question falls within what we call a closed framework. So that it's not an open-ended question per se, that there are some bounds to it that you can define, and that you can say, if a study falls into these categories, they will be part of review because they have the capacity to illustrate whatever question is that we've illustrated or that we've chosen. So what we do is we define 4 elements within a PICO or a PECO framework, which stands for population. So what's the subject of the studies, the intervention or the exposure. So what's a factor or the action that you're looking at that impacts that population. What's your comparator? So for this, in this case, you're looking at what is sort of the study design that allows you to actually measure impact or change. So you can imagine that a descriptive study that describes, say, the state of an ecosystem does not necessarily have a comparator. It's describing a state with no comparison of time or space, or et cetera. So your comparators can be either there's no intervention and no exposure compared to when there is an intervention and exposure. So sometimes we call that the control or counterfactual type design. You can also look at comparisons over space, over time, over different social or demographic groups. You can look at comparisons between different types of systems. And this will just depend on what the scope of your review is. Oftentimes with a systematic map, we're broadly interested to understand how have scientists, authors been studying or trying to attribute change or understand causality and trying to understand the breadth of the study designs that are out there. For systematic review, we're really only interested in documenting when there's attributable change. So we may want to restrict your study design, your comparator there, to only including studies that have a control or a counterfactual. And then lastly is O, which is your outcome. So this is the change in what the measured, change in variables that you're interested in measuring that are attributable to that intervention or that exposure. So I'm going to take a pause here and ask, does anyone have questions so far? I'm going to run also through a example. No? Okay. Just least questioning crowd of all questions. Okay. So let's, why is this not showing? Okay. Okay, so running through this is an example of how we start to parse out what are our different PICO elements within the components of our question. So this is the question: what is the effect of neonicotinoid pesticides on pollinator performance? So any guesses of what the population would be here?
Pollinators.
Pollinators? Any other thoughts? Nods? Okay. Yep, so your population is on pollinators. All right, what is our intervention? What else? Pesticides? Pesticides? Okay. What are our outcomes?
Differences in performance.
Cool. All right. You guys are so good at this. Okay. So this, you can see then, is when you can sort of look at your question and ensure that your question incorporates all of your PICO, or not, 3 of your PICO elements. Often it's difficult to clarify what your comparators are in your question because they're going to be specific to sort of the scale of rigor that you would like to capture in your study. So this, I think, is just the second example. So what's the effectiveness of conversion to organic farming? So your intervention and exposure there is the conversion to organic farming. And that does imply that there's a comparator there. So it's not just what are the effects of organic farming, what are the effects of switching to organic farming? So implying that you need to have non-organic farming as part of those studies that are be part of this synthesis. Okay. Okay, so when you think about your suitability of your question, if you are able to define it within that closed framework, then comes to the point where you decide, okay, am I going to take a broad scope question, or am I going to take a more narrow one? So if you want to look more at impacts, you tend to then pursue a systematic review where you have more narrowly defined PICO elements to try and really narrow down into a specific system. So you can imagine that if you're looking at a really broad question and you're trying to understand these pathways of impact, there are going to be a lot of pathways. And you may not be able to focus in on a particular pathway given the scope and the broad body of evidence that you're going to be drawing from. Systematic reviews, on the other hand, you can sort of get to that point where you're using your broad scope to illustrate where a review could happen. So we like to, I've been trying to retire this analogy for a while now, but you can think about, but apparently it's never going to die. Gabby, I was talking to Louise yesterday, and she was like, let's talk about it like a treasure map. And I was like, oh no, not the treasure map again. But you can think about your systematic map as a treasure map. It's telling you where you can dig for evidence. And so if you have that map, you don't necessarily know if you're going to dig and you're going to find something that's good, or you're going to find something that's bad. Or as some of my collaborators who say, you can find a pot of gold, or you can find a treasure chest full of empty rum bottles. So you have no idea what is underneath that layer in your map, but it does tell you there's a large quantity of potentially useful information. And then you can use your systematic review as a tool to explore that particular treasure chest and see what's in there. Okay, so to get to that point, you're going to need to define a protocol. And so this is where we're going to do a little more interactive work here. So there's a Google Drive link that I sent you guys, that if you want to pull it up, that's going to essentially cover the first number of steps for setting up a systematic review protocol. You'll see at the beginning, it says like introduction. Why are you doing this? State your problem. If you are planning on publishing your review, and you want to publish as an officially certified CE systematic map or review, then you'll need to start writing something like this. So some placeholders there for you guys to think about. So if you want to follow along, and if you can't get the link or it's not working, let me know. We all good? Okay.
Which email is it?
Which email? It's in the calendar invite, I think.
Oh, okay.
Which page do you want? It's the first one that says, here's a draft skeleton. Okay. So starting your review by starting to fill out this protocol and share it amongst your review team will help ensure that there is transparency amongst the review team, but also for people who are going to use it, and also will help you guys stay on the same page. So that when you start reviewing, especially for a large review team, like you guys doing the oceans map, you're going to need to make sure that everyone's interpreting all of your categories, all of your inclusion and exclusion criteria about what articles are actually going to be in your review in the same way, so that there's consistency. Yes, sorry, words. And this will improve both the quality and the reliability of your review itself. Okay, so the first sort of thing you need to do, which is really useful when you're doing this, is start to scope what is this review actually going to take. Because you could think of a question and perhaps you start searching and doing a little bit of background research, and you either discover there's no information on this question, which sometimes is the case, or there's way too much information, and that's when you need to start scoping. You need to start focusing your review questions to really get at what is answerable. So what it also lets you sort of estimate is if you say retrieve 1,000 results versus 10,000 results, it'll give you an idea of what resources are needed for you to get through it, what's the timeline. There's actually a really cool tool out there. It's like this, I don't know what to call it. It's called predicter.org. And it allows you, once you start to do some of the scoping where you know how many search results you're going to get, sort of what percent you think are going to be relevant, it tells you how much time it's going to take based on, they did this huge survey of basically anyone who's ever done a Cincinnati review and asked them, okay, tell us how much time it took for your reviews, like how many search results did you get, how many people did you have on your team, and the key, how much did it cost you guys, so that you can actually go through and be like, okay, can we actually do this, or are we going to run out of money halfway through or run out of time? So that's pretty cool. You can play around with that. And so how do we actually search, or how do we actually scope this review? So one, you want to test your search strategy, which is going to first include, or it's going to first require you guys to define what search sources do you want to look within. So for example, peer-reviewed databases, which ones, how many, how easy are they to use, and then your gray literature sources. Are you going to search Google, or are you going to search, which organization websites are you going to search? How many of them? And what's the search strategy that you're going to use to search within? So what are your search terms that you're defining, and how are they connected together? Which of those search terms are useful? So you can imagine, if you included in your search terms the word "the," you're going to end up with a lot of results because it's a commonly used word. So we'll talk more about searching in a minute, but then, so what you want to do then is you want to go through your search results and see, okay, what's the volume of stuff that you're turning up? Is that stuff even relevant? So say you're searching for, the effect of ant colonies on leaf litter, making that up, and you end up getting stuff on garbage pickup instead, then that's not necessarily that's relevant, so you may want to go back and refine. And then lastly, you want to be able to trial your data extraction and your critical appraisal if you're doing that. Oftentimes, I think we all get really excited about the review, and we want to get out as much information as possible. I certainly do that, because I'm like, well, if we're reading the paper, we might as well record all this information anyways. However, that can be really time consuming. So being able to refine your data extraction of what information you're drawing out from your papers is going to be key to really understanding how much time it's going to take. Okay, so this is the part that we're going to start with, and I want you guys to have a think, within the context of your questions, for your reviews, what this might be. And then you might also want to think about this, at least Sarah and Elliot and Keisha, if you are ever going to do a review within the context of your thesis or your graduate work, how this might be able to help you sort of conceptualize what your questions are and what the system, the components of the system are. So most evidence syntheses are using something called the theory of change or conceptual model and planning out their review and planning out what their questions are. And what it does is it's linking so the elements and the components of your question together with, so you're taking your population, your intervention, your exposure, and then linking these together and trying to explain how we think by doing this action, we will achieve these outcomes. And what this allows you to do is outline what are these assumptions that underlie the pathways between doing something and an intermediate outcome, and then there's maybe a secondary outcome, and then your desired outcome at the end. But what it allows you to do is be very specific about how you think the exposure or the intervention is going to bring about change. So I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and so we both came out of the very like head in the lab natural sciences world. And I was talking about theory of change, which came from social sciences and development, education, sort of programming, and is now being more widely used. And he was like, don't we just mean hypotheses? And so you can also think about theory of change as your hypothesis of how you think something is going to happen. But what it does do, that's not always used in hypotheses, they're illustrated in this graphical way. So it's very clear to whoever's reading your paper what your hypothesis or your theory of change that drives your question is. And this is something important to consider, not just in systematic reviewing, but also in when you're talking about really complex systems, such as what we deal with in conservation. So, for example, in this theory of change, they're saying, okay, the action, the exposure or intervention is decreasing native species due to invasive species. So this is exposure. Or due to decreasing, okay, right. And so they're looking then at, okay, from that, this leads to these different types of actions in response, which then leads to these different types of intermediate outcomes where you're excluding, eradicating, controlling different populations. And this is what they're looking to achieve, that if you do these things, it'll decrease invasive species populations, which will lead to an increase in native species populations. So then it's clear that if you weren't very closely embedded within that group, you still know what they're talking about. Oftentimes when you read a paragraph, a narrative description of a theory of change, it's hard to parse out exactly which parts are connected to what, whereas this is quite intuitive. It's words and arrows. Okay. I'm gonna skip through that, but I'm just, sorry, there's too many builds in this. Whatever. Okay, so that last slide, particularly you guys at WWF, I would just, go back, use this as a reference. I'll send you guys these slides for when you're doing the stakeholder engagement process. Willa, when you're out there at the offices now, just to keep some of those points in mind. Okay, let's make sure I don't lose all of these. Okay, so just a summary of what's critical to consider. The question that we're picking needs to be clear. It needs to have that closed framework where we're identifying our PICO elements, and then we need to be able to then illustrate how these components are connected together using our theory of change. And this process isn't happening in a bubble, it's happening within a team, so make sure you involve everyone in this process to make sure you get at what are the central components that we want to answer. Okay, so questions before we get into our exercise? No? Room? No? Okay, all right. Okay, so this is, you're not really working in small groups, kind of working on your own here, but I want you guys to go to that document. Don't work on it on the Google Drive because then everyone will be working on the Google Drive. Just download it, which could be entertaining. Just be like a competition of who can write the fastest. So I would download that, and what I want you guys to look at is the part that says, what is your research question? And then there's a table for your PICO. And so I want you guys to take a stab at trying to fill that out and being very explicit, particularly within your PICO elements. And so some of the documents I sent you guys sometime this week, you can see that there are published protocols that are there that are very clear with defining what the PICO elements are. So you can see what level of information you should aim for when you're doing this. And then if you, let's spend like 15 minutes doing this or so. And then if it's relevant to your paper or your project, to start to sketch out what you think a theory of change might be. It doesn't have to be perfect, just to get you sort of your creative juices flowing and your theory of change hat on, to start working on that. And that might be something useful for you guys, Willa, for your team, to start brainstorming what are all the possible different ways we're trying to link these elements together, because you guys are looking at quite a broad question. So something maybe useful to keep for later. Okay, let's go for it.
Hey, Sam.
Yeah.
I have a question. Do you want me to do the one that I'm working on currently? I don't know how much you guys have already done this on the team or not.
Sarah, is that you? Sorry, I can't.
Yes, this is Sarah. Sorry.
Yes. So, Sarah, since you're doing more of a scoping review, looking at these elements of, what are these types of valuation approaches, it would be actually maybe since you've done a little thinking on, the data tools and how data tools might impact or assist learning, maybe you can think about it that way.
Okay.
Others on the phone? Questions? No? Okay. I realize we're like a slightly large group to do a bunch of sharing, so maybe I'm going to mute you guys, Duke folks, or wait, how am I doing this? Or I'm just going to turn the volume down. If you guys want to discuss amongst yourselves, since you are all working on the same question, to start coming up with your PICO and PICO or PECO, that's fine. And then you can always share one in 10, 15 minutes or so. Cool.
I'm going to take off my headphones for the Duke people so you guys can discuss with each other if you want to, but maybe like someone wave at the screen or something if you're starting again and you don't think I'm paying attention.
Okay, cool. Me on my cell if you need something. Or just bellow over their conversation. Okay, cool. All right, let's reconvene in like 10, 15 minutes.
Cool.
Okay. Hello, Duke people.
No. Hello.
Oh, I guess I should mute us. Okay. I'm also gonna email you guys these slides.
So I don't have a great idea of what our question is. This is Elizabeth, just because we haven't started it yet. So if anyone has more, has been a part of it already or starting working on it, like Willa or somebody else has a better idea, I'd love to hear.
So I've been working on this for, I guess, the last 2 weeks, and this is interesting. I'm still like taking in all of the knowledge right now. I can take a little while to process things initially, like full disclosure. So maybe if we just go like one by one through the different things with PICO, that might be good.
Okay.
So population.
Subject of our study. So we're looking at the coral reefs, mangroves, and seagrasses. Would that be our population, or?
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, like that's the first thing. And so our areas of interest are these 3 habitats, but they're ecosystems, and I don't know if that makes them a population.
Yeah.
That worked out last.
So if we went forward with the idea that those 3 habitats were our population, what then would be the factor acting upon that population?
I guess the various different conservation interventions.
Okay.
And so it might be more specifically WWF interventions.
Okay.
So I'm looking right now at the example that they gave, and I'm trying to think of it through that way. So the example that she gave was offering a question and then identifying PICO within the question. So the question, or at least one of them, was what is the effect of neonicotinoid pesticides on pollinator performance?
Mm-hmm.
And so modeling that, I'm thinking maybe something like, what is the effect of conservation interventions on maybe like the
just like overall health of those 3 ecosystems, or
maybe what was the effect? Let me stop typing things. What's the effect of conservation?
Really mostly just suited up you already have versus if you did.
On
So if you don't have one, yeah. What's generally the information on X, Y, you may want to think about.
Like this is sort of what needs to be scoped, right? To do
Right.
initial structure and see like what do we really trying to get at here.
is there like a
Well,
I'm trying to think like what I've even seen about this project? Like, is there some sort of like write-up or something that we could be looking at?
I'm looking at just the Basque Connections website.
Yeah, just like that blurb.
Yeah.
Is that all we have?
Well, feel free to ask me general questions about like our objective, because I probably can answer those. I'm just trying to think of it within like.
Yeah.
But
So
if you have
guys,
general
if you have a
questions,
question, just bellow at me. I should be able to hear you.
Cool. I think our questions are more like specific as to what exactly the question for our project is.
Okay, good. Those are good questions.
Pico.
Those are good questions. Cool.
so I don't know. I'm just like saying words at this point. But what I'm doing at WWF, I don't know if this will be like helpful for us sort of framing our understanding of what we're trying to do with this gap map, is essentially we're trying to create a gap map of interventions and outcomes, i.e. how a gap map is sort of developed. And what we want to do is to be able to map out the different interventions that WWF has employed and get a sense of the outcomes that have been connected to those interventions and see where research has and hasn't been done. And so I guess like an example of that could be that WWF does a lot of research on marine protected areas, and they may frequently look at the ecological outcomes in terms of species diversity and coral health, but they might not spend as much time looking at some of the social outcomes in terms of the direct benefits to the community and the amount of fish that they're able to take from the protected area, for example. So I guess in our gap map, we're trying to make an intervention based on like kind of what WWF is doing, or that at least encompasses that, and trying to identify the ecological and social outcomes of these interventions. I don't know if that was helpful at all.
Yeah, so what was the beginning of that question you started to formulate, Willa?
So the question that was in the slideshow that we're gonna try to model this after was, what is the effect of neonicotinoid pesticides on pollinator performance?
I mean, do we think that like for our project in general, it would be more useful to have like a series of questions split up by like type of intervention and whatever, like type of habitat, like of the 3 habitats, rather than trying to just do one broad question? Or
Well, I don't think that there's necessarily a correct answer to that, but my thought is that it depends if we're trying to do like one gap map that sort of encompasses all 3 habitats, or if we're trying to do like 3 separate gap maps. Because I think that since we're doing a gap map, the question should be, I was thinking of one like broad question, but I mean, I guess you could do multiple questions. I don't know.
I think when I'm thinking about it, the difference where there would be 2 possible questions, I think of the outcomes, because it's talking about natural outcomes and then the social outcomes.
Yes.
So it just seems like it would be very hard to try and include all of those in one map, to try and include a natural outcome and the social outcomes. So I was initially thinking of separating it versus the type of outcome, but just a thought.
So that makes sense. And I think that within the gap map itself, they actually do things to be able to do that even visually. They have categories and subcategories. So they have like, they can have overarching categories saying that these are the environmental outcomes, and that then they list a whole bunch of like interventions like below like environmental, or outcomes below environmental. And then they have social outcomes. And so that way you can get a sense looking at it like of all of the things at once.
Okay.
Um,
For the sake of the exercise, do we want to just try and do the one broad question?
yeah, probably.
that's a good idea.
So I keep forgetting the question that was the example, but basically just saying what are the effects of the conservation interventions on the 3 habitats is out their well-being, or their natural or social outcomes, I guess.
So maybe it's what's the effect of the conservation interventions within our 3 habitats of interest on the social and ecological, what am I thinking? What are the effects of the conservation interventions within mangroves, coral reefs, and seagrass, on the communities which rely on them? I don't think that's right.
So by communities, you mean both like human and otherwise?
What's the effect of conservation interventions on, let me file there. Let's see, get shareable link. Any random link can edit. All right, I'm just going to send you a Google Doc where I copied and pasted things on the.
Could maybe just switching the order of what we're saying could help. So what are the social or natural effects or outcomes of conservation interventions on the 3 areas?
Habitats, yeah.
Can you say that one more time? And also, I just added a Google Doc on the chat for the Duke people to click on so that we can all kind of make comments and edits on the thing that I threw up there.
Cool.
And then I'll also copy and paste the example thing that she had.
I said, what are the social and natural or ecological outcomes of conservation interventions in those 3 habitats?
What are the
social?
Can you type it? Just type it like under where I did mine, like around where I have my little cursor.
Yeah, so I typed the question.
Well, I'm still kind of stuck between if our populations are habitats or if they're the people that rely on utilizing our habitats.
I think that it would be the habitats. Why would you think that it would be the people?
What is it? Okay, so I guess it's true that we want to know what the effect of the interventions are on the habitats and also understand the outcomes of like, so what the effect of the interventions are and as a result of what that effect is, like,
I mean, I guess I could see if we're looking at the natural impacts, then I would say that the outcomes are the interventions or the exposures are affecting the habitat, those and habitats being the populations. But when looking at the social outcomes, I would say that the people are what's being affected by the interventions. So that would be the case for having 2 different questions.
Yeah. Hey guys, I'm gonna just pop in quickly. Do you have any questions that perhaps I'm sorry, words. Seems like you guys are having a good discussion, so I think that's sort of part of the process. So I'm glad. But do you have any specific questions that I might be able to illuminate?
Well, right now we're kind of talking about identifying our population and seeing if it makes sense that our like habitats, the area that we're focusing on, if that's our population. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's going to be both, right? Because you guys are looking both at social and ecological impacts.
So is it possible to have one broad question or that we can have multiples?
So oftentimes, if you have quite a nested or complex set of questions, you might have one or two really broad questions, but then you might have some secondary, more specific ones. So for example, you might ask, what are the impacts of marine conservation interventions on social and ecological impacts? And one of your secondary questions can be, what are the specific impacts within root mangroves or a specific impact in whatever. So you can break out your questions in whichever ways make most sense instead of trying to cram them all into one sentence. But in your PICO, you can clarify each of those points. So if your population, you might want to say, we're looking at marine habitats or marine ecosystems within these types of major habitat types or biomes or ecoregions, however you're breaking it down. Human populations, human communities that directly depend or utilize marine resources or something. Or if you're looking indirectly, it might be indirect. So, or you might be looking at explicit populations versus global trends, right? So you might be looking for, individuals and groups versus looking at, provides ecosystem services to the world. So you can start to break into that PICO or that population element a bit by thinking through, okay, well, what are we looking at in terms of people, or what are we looking at in terms of ecosystems?
Cool, thank you.
Well, yeah. I do want to go over searching with you guys, but maybe while you keep thinking about your PICO, I'm just gonna, can someone wave to Sarah?
Oh, I'm here.
Oh, you're back. Okay, good. I'm going to share my screen again with you guys, and I just want to show you when you're on Colander where you can set this up. So this is good for tracking progress. So what you can do when you set up your reviews is share the screen. So when you set up your review, you can add as many, where's my mouse? Oh, where is my mouse? Oh, there we go. You can set up as many reviewers in your review as you want. So the first thing I want to show you guys is in settings. So if you navigate yourself back to Colander for a minute, I'm going to just wait a minute or 10 seconds maybe. So if you are, that's locked me out. So when you get to your review homepage, you're going to want to create a review. If for the sake of this exercise, just create a review, even if you have one existing. And what you're going to want to do is, actually, I'll do that as well. Create a review. So it'll ask you for a review name. Just create a review. And the description. So systematic review for training course on evidence. Just create. Okay, so now it's going to have created your review. Mine's at the bottom. So when you open it, you can go to settings, and you can see there's your basic information for review. You can change this whenever you want. And then you'll see an area that says collaboration. So if you're setting a review and you want other people to collaborate on it, for example, for you guys, for the marine map, you want to be able to share this review with all of the reviewers. So you just, once everyone's signed up for Colander, you can invite them using the email they use to sign up. Okay. And then this part here for collaboration is how many screeners you need. So we haven't covered screening yet today, but recall that I said that you want your review teams to be more than one person, because one person's insight is great. However, that does then reflect the biases of that reviewer. So you typically want at least 2 reviewers for every review, so that there's consistency, one, in how the reviews are being screened and how they're being coded, or how the data is being extracted, to add not necessarily extra, to really emphasize reliability of that review. So you can change this to 2. We'll all go over this we'll go over this more. We're having a webinar on how to use Calendar on June 6th. They'll go into this more in detail of some sort of technological glitches in the software, because this is an open source, open access software, and sort of we can only develop it so far with the time we have. There are some issues here when you change screeners. And then if you ever don't want to do your review, or someone's messing around with it and causing chaos, you can freeze the review if you're the administrator to stop people from changing stuff, or you can delete it. And if you delete your review, you can never get it back. So don't delete your review haphazardly. Okay, so let's go back and go to your planning section. So here an objective is where you can start to articulate your research questions. This is not going to be used in any of the machine learning parts of the review, but it is good to outline these as a commonplace when you develop your protocol with the rest of your team. And then here you have your PICO elements, and here's where you can describe each one of your PICO elements, what's in it, what's not in it. And again, this is not used for learning, it's for reference for the rest of the review. Oh, sorry, objective. So, okay, so your objective is gonna be something broader, like we wanna illustrate the impact of X on Y. And then your research questions, here's where you can add your multiple questions. So for example, if you have lots of secondary questions in your review, then you can start to just lay these out more clearly here. And then, so you can just add a question like, why do subscribe? Oh, well, nope, not adding. What am I doing? Oh. Why are you not letting me type? Uh-oh.
Mine's giving me the same problem.
I need to okay. Hold on, everyone. I need to restart the server. So you can also tell that sometimes things like this happen. So if you ever run into a glitch with Calendar, I would go to the home page, and when you go back to when you're at the login page, there'll be a link for help, and this will take you to the Calendar community page. So go onto the floor, and this will have a form that says bug reporting, so you can report bugs that happen, or you can just email me. Because sometimes things get a little bit wonky and we need to reset the server. Which I'm going to just quickly do now, and maybe they'll solve this problem. While I do that, how is setting up your questions? Do you guys have questions? I guess guys in the room and people on the phone. No? Maybe? I will say that the process of generating your question and the PICO elements of your question do require, it's not necessarily a fast process, it is quite iterative over time, especially as you find new information. What I was saying when I had you guys on mute was that sometimes your question requires its own sort of mini scoping review to figure out what's actually a valid question to ask and what sort of the components of that question, because sometimes you can have really broad questions of just generally like, what have been the impacts on, or what are the impacts of conservation, for example. That's a really big question. And so to try and get at, well, what do we mean by it? You do need to do a little bit of scoping to understand, well, what are all the components that are required to answer a question like that? Or like an example from, something, the work that we're doing over here is trying to understand what are the ways in which we can translate science to action and conservation. And so those are quite big questions that have lots of different components. And so we're sort of in the scoping review stage for you guys to investigate, what are the components at different stages of that process? What are the stages of that process? So that we can identify what are the questions that are most relevant to be asked and most salient, really, and feasible. So, we're not going to figure out your PICOs right now, per se, or your final PICOs now. Okay, so if you're in Calendar, I would just, I would refresh the page. I just reset the server. And I'll go back to your review. And let's see, add a question. Nope, it still doesn't work. Okay, well, you can't add your questions. I take it back. Put it in your objective. Yeah, okay. So whenever you add something to a field in Calendar, just make sure you click Save afterwards. There. So now it's saved. So you can, anytime you need to edit it, you can edit it. Just make sure you click Save. Okay. So I wanted to go over, sort of have you guys identify at least the beginning of your PICO elements, because that will be really useful for as you start developing your search terms. So as you think about, what goes into your population intervention, comparator, and outcome, those will be really helpful for when you think about what types of terminology, what types of keywords you're going to use, and in what combination to search for information in these sources. So if you scroll down to this section that says search terms, this is where you can start developing your search string. So I'll give you guys a little primer on developing search strings, and then I think we'll just go over that document. One of the documents I sent you guys in the chat window and also in the invite, that was a Google Drive link to an Excel spreadsheet. We'll go over that in a minute, or maybe after the primer. Just to give you an idea of how we start to brainstorm all those different terms to search with, because I think, as we all well know, people make up new words for stuff. There's always like a trendy new buzzword. And if we want to capture all the knowledge that was labeled with the buzzwords over time, we need to sort of lay those out and sort of brainstorm what are all those words and which ones are actually useful and which ones aren't. Because, I think if we were looking in a very narrow field, we may not need to brainstorm that many terms. So, for example, in medicine, if we're talking about diseases, if you're talking about influenza, there's only a few ways you can talk about it, right? You can talk about the flu, you can talk about influenza, you can talk about the scientific name. That's it. But then we think about something like protected areas. What are all the ways that we can talk about protected areas? We can talk about protected area, we can talk about marine reserve, we can talk about fencing, we can talk about extractive reserves, we can talk about biosphere reserves. Those are all protected areas in some way, shape, or form. So being able to generate those terms, figure out which ones are useful for you and relevant to your question and which ones are not useful, will be part of the process of developing your search string. Okay, so let me grab. I've now lost the presentation. Searching? Aha, okay, here we go. All right, cool. Okay, so, all right, we're at this part of the process of searching. So typically when you're developing your protocol, you're also developing your search string and you're using it to scope what literature is available out there. So you're gonna be back and forth between these two steps for quite some time. But they're searching when you Google something, right? And then there's systematic searching where you're trying to find all possible available evidence, which sounds very ambitious, which it is, to answer your question. So the goal with systematic searching is that you have a comprehensive search strategy that tries to capture all available information, is that it's transparent and it's also repeatable, reproducible. So when you read a literature review, so the typical literature review, for example, you do for a class, you do for your beginning of your graduate studies, you read in a journal, oftentimes they just talk about a bunch of papers and a bunch of themes, and you have no idea how they found those papers. And so that review is in essence not reproducible. Somebody else cannot say, oh, let me update it for more current literature, because you have no idea what that person did. What systematic evidence synthesis does is that by outlining that really clear protocol with your search strategy, you can update these at any time, and you can make this a living resource for others to use and others to update over time as knowledge is generated and as knowledge changes. Okay, so in part of the search strategy, it has to be well documented, but it also allows you to develop a search method that allows you to use your time and your resources the most efficient way possible. So you're not sort of searching and then going, oh, I should have searched this other thing, or I should have searched this other thing. And so there's a clear sort of process to doing this. And then what it also helps you do is minimize what potential impacts of bias are. So you can have bias in the number of reviewers and who's choosing the literature, but it also, and so that's your selection bias, but it also allows you to minimize publication bias. So stuff that's not necessarily put in peer-reviewed literature, you can also develop a strategy to search for it and try and capture that information. And then if you work with an information specialist at the library, they can help you minimize what's calling public indexing bias, because different studies are indexed by databases in different ways. So they're given different key terms. They're put in different categories. So when you search in, say, Web of Science, and then you run your search again in Scopus, another one, or in CAB, you're not necessarily going to get the same results, because they index their papers in different ways. They put them in different categories, and they don't cover the same journals. So when you work with an information specialist, they can help you navigate all of those issues. Okay, so there is an issue with publication bias. We tend to find studies that are reporting positive or significant results more likely to be published, and they're more likely to be perceived as important, hence why they're more likely to be published. So if you find nothing, so say you did a study and you've actually found that nothing happened, that there were no statistically different changes, that had no effect, people don't really publish those because it's not seen as something important or something that's high impact. So there is something to take into account in understanding that these biases exist in the literature and how you might try and account for them. One way you can do that is by searching grade literature, so stuff that isn't inherently publishable per se in a peer-reviewed journal. And these are produced by all different types of authors in different organizations, and they're produced in ways that are free, if that makes sense. So they're published, you're not paying a fee to publish it in a journal. So the intent, oftentimes these reports come from organizations where publishing is not the end goal. They're not buying into the swindling of the publication industry and the publishing industry. I'm having a bit of a moment with publishing, where so that the people choosing to publish your papers are technically peer review, but also the journals who's limited in publishing by how much they can pay. Okay, so there's, getting off my high horse now. And, for example, this is something from healthcare where they looked at the rate of acceptance of papers and stuff that report positive results, positive impact, are more likely to be published and faster. The other issue with publication bias is that your data is going to have different levels of availability. So there's all data that's out there, right? Then there's all data that's available and accessible, which is going to be slightly smaller. There's published data, which is a little bit easier to get to, but doesn't accomplish all available data. There's data that's published, but not in the major databases. Then you might miss some of those out. And then there's stuff that's open access, which is easily accessible and technically indexed for everyone to find. So when you design your search strategy, you want to think about sort of that hierarchy of accessibility and visibility of publications. So first you need to choose where you want to search. So how many databases do you want to search? How many gray literature sources do you want to search? Why do you want to search them? For example, if you were looking for, say, impacts on economic livelihoods, for example, you might want to search a big database like Web of Science, but you might also want to search a smaller database that's specialized like EconLit. Or if you wanted to look for agricultural data, you might want to look at, what is it called? AGRIS, AGRIS, which is run by FAO, which covers agricultural literature and data. If you're looking, say, at forest studies and mostly forest studies, you might want to look at CAB and CAB Direct, because those are specialized databases for those topic areas. Whereas there are large databases like Web of Science, like Scopus, Web of Knowledge, that you can search that are going to cover a broader range of information, but will often turn up much more search results that may or may not be relevant to you. And then once you've chosen where you want to search, you want to choose your search term. So this is what I was talking about with your PICO elements. As you define your categories of PICO, you want to think about what is the list of words that could describe each of those elements and the synonyms that you can think of that would fall in those categories. And then what you want to do is you want to take all those terms and start testing them. You're testing them individually, testing them in combination, and you want to combine them in different sets to try and see how much of the potential evidence base you can capture with different sets of terms. Thinking about your logical limits or your feasible limits, how far back do you want to search? Do you want to search all possible literature contained in these databases? Sometimes they go back as far as, some go back as far as 1970, some go back to like the 1800s. Do you want to search in English only? Do you want to search in other languages? And that'll depend on the scope of your question and who is intended to be the final audience. And then you want, after you've sort of defined all these elements of your search strategy and you start to collate it together, you want to be able to test it. So what are you getting when you search? How many hits? Are they relevant? Are any of the key references you've identified, are they getting picked up? So we call this our test library. So we tend to put together a list of 20 or so, 20 to 30 articles that we think are relevant and think should be found in our search, and see whether your search picks up. And sometimes it picks up, sometimes they don't. Sometimes things are indexed in really strange ways and you can never find it. But that's a way of testing your strategy. So I kind of already went over this, but other sources to bring up, I already talked about these larger databases and the ones that are discipline or region specific. The other sources are where theses are deposited. Pretty sure that's not the right word for that, where your theses are filed. I can't remember the name of that, to be honest. It's just completely escaped me for the minute. ProQuest is where a lot of theses are filed, and so this is technically published, but not in a peer-reviewed journal. And you also might want to look for conference proceedings, for example. Okay. And then where can you start looking for grade literature? One is these organizational websites. So for example, searching the websites of WWF, searching the websites of Conservation International, of the World Bank. You can also use Google or the GrayNet. I actually don't know what the GrayNet is. I'm not sure if that's another way of, I'm not sure if that's another way of talking about Google. But something to consider when you're using Google is, you search for something you think is quite simple in Google, and next thing you know, they're like, there's 25 million hits, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna look at the first page. So if you end up with a lot of hits on Google, how do you go through them? Do you go through all of them, or do you go through some of them? And what are you missing? You can also ask people to submit evidence to you. If you get on Twitter these days and you look at like the hashtag conservation evidence, there are people putting out calls to be like, send me anything you have that looks at this, to get this from sort of the expert solicitation method. And then you can also look at databases. You can also find these databases by asking the people who work in that area or the stakeholders involved. Okay. So in this last bit, I want to go over how we can structure your search terms and start to develop them. So typically what we use is 3 out of the 4 PICO elements. So the first is the population. The community that's being affected. So if you are, say, looking at mangroves, your population search term could be mangrove or whatever synonyms you think of for that. Your intervention or exposure, like I started detailing with protected areas, those would be your search terms for that category. And then for outcome, the variable that's being measured, if say we're interested in looking at impacts on fish, we might want to look up things like fish abundance or fish health or fish species richness. Or if we know that there's a certain species of fish, we can start putting in those terms. And this will depend on what outcomes you're looking at. You might also want to use different sets of search terms for location. So say you're only interested in, in countries in Southeast Asia. You might want to put Southeast Asia or Coral Triangle or, the list of country names in that area. You can also put stuff in about study type. So say you're only interested in randomized control trials. It would be really helpful if you just put randomized control trial there. If you're not, if you're looking at all different types of studies, this may not be relevant. And so you want to think about the different ways you want to structure your search terms. Okay. I did kind of go over an example. This is an example from a systematic view on whether or not a wild dog reintroductions in South Africa are an effective conservation tool. So here they've identified the components of their question. So the population, that is the wild dogs in South Africa. The intervention is the reintroductions, and the outcome is effective conservation tool. I think that's a terrible outcome. But if that's the scope of their review, they might just be looking at how it's implemented. It's not clear right yet. But then, some of the things you want to think about are, okay, well, wild dogs. How do we talk about wild dogs? Is there a local name for them, or a Latin name that you can use? What are different ways people talk about reintroduction, translocation? You also will think about how people spell things differently. Some people hyphenate. There's like this whole human well-being. Sometimes people hyphenate well-being. Sometimes they stick it together into one word. So you want to incorporate all those different spelling variations as well as synonyms. And then think about what sort of abbreviations might be commonly used. Oops, okay. I just want to get all these up here. So you can see how you can start to structure these terms, right? So you've got wild dog, the Latin name, you've got all these local names for wild dog. You can see with the quotation marks around it, that's going to look for that as a phrase together. If you didn't have those, it might search for them as individual words. And then your introduction term, or your intervention terms have an asterisk, meaning a wild card. So it's going to find any word in your titles, abstracts, keywords that start with this root and end with whatever. So you can say translocate, translocations, translocating, and it would find all of those.
Do you add the asterisk, or does it do it automatically?
You have to add it.
Okay.
So when you design your search string, you will have to be clear about where you want to incorporate a wildcard when you don't. And there are all different ways of incorporating wildcards before or after a term. And you could also do different types of Boolean operators, which I'm talking about now, but that you can say, I'm looking for this term, adjacent to or nearby this other term. If you're trying to look for terms within a sentence, if it's not a phrase, but a way of talking about something. So the most databases and some of your web searches can incorporate these Boolean operators. So these are your logic operators. If we bring ourselves back to high school math, maybe, where we learned about logic and how you can put together different logic models. In this case, you're connecting your different terms using these logical operators. So if you have an or connecting two words, if you search with an abstract, you'll find your results will be anything that contains wild dog or the Latin name. And if you use an and, it has to have both of those terms in the same abstract. So that's going to start reducing the number of results that you get. So for example, you know, if you go back to this, where we talk about the components in each one of your Pico elements, you wouldn't want to have and, right, in between your population terms, because then it's going to try and find a document that has all of those terms in it. But you would want to put or, say, between those, but then you connect your population terms and your intervention terms with an and. One of the things you can also put in is not. So, for example, if you are interested in looking at a set of words, but you know there's one word you definitely don't want because it's either going to turn up a lot of irrelevant results or is commonly used when, you know, if it's a vague term, is commonly used in the wrong context. I've rarely found not to be useful, but you can introduce not to try and refine your results.
Is it case sensitive?
No.
No.
It is not case sensitive.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Oh, you might be about to get to it, actually,
Okay.
so I'll wait a minute.
Okay. It's about combining terms. Okay, so I just talked about this, about where you want to put an or and where would you want to put an and. So you want to connect sets of terms. So basically this is saying, okay, search through this database, pull up any citation file that has a title, abstract, or keyword that has something from the first set of words, at least one, and something from the second set of words. And it can be any one of those terms in the second set, any one of the terms in this first set. Okay, so what you want to try and strive for is either perhaps a sensitive search or maybe a more specific search. So a sensitive search is one where you're trying to capture as many studies as possible to try and capture all possible studies that are relevant to you. What's going to happen in this case is that there are only going to be a set of relevant records within the universe of knowledge. When you do a very sensitive search, it's going to capture way more than you need. And so while this ensures that you'll find more of the relevant studies, it's going to be a lot more time consuming because you're going to find a lot more of the other things. Whereas you do a more specific search, you're more likely to find less records, but you may miss some of the relevant ones. And so this is just something to consider as you make your search more and more specific, that you may end up missing things that are relevant to you because you're asking for too many requirements. And, you know, as much as we emphasize how to write a good abstract, you'll soon find going through this process that people write pretty terrible abstracts. Like sometimes people write abstracts with lots of buzzwords to get it a lot more attention, to get people to find it faster. So you can think about, you know, if you're running a website or a business, you're going to put certain keywords in the way that people find your website to drive up traffic. Same with abstracts and keywords, although I'm sure there are many people out there in science who would be quite offended with that statement that you're using keywords to drive up traffic to your paper. But you want people to read it, right? So you want people to be able to find it. So you want to think about that as you're searching. And, you know, there isn't a perfect way of searching. You can try your best to get a comprehensive search, but I think you're always going to know that something's going to be lacking. So keeping in mind where you might have some shortfalls, and shortfalls are okay as long as you clearly state it in your protocol or in your results that there are caveats to how comprehensive your searching was. And oftentimes you'll read these systematic syntheses. People will say, we endeavor to make the search as comprehensive as possible, but we were limited by time. So therefore, when we encountered 10 million hits on Google Scholar or on Google, we only looked at the first like 5,000. And, you know, that's the sort of compromise that they had to make. Okay, so I am going to maybe skip this. Well, actually, this is kind of helpful. Oops. Okay, so when you're coming up with your PICO, you might start with something quite simple where you're like, okay, we're looking at peatland soils and we're looking at draining and rewetting. There's lots of peatland studies out there. But you can see how you start thinking of all these different ways in which you could talk about your population, your interventions, and your outcomes. You know, you can see that there's organic matter, dissolved organic matter, the DOM, and organic contents. And so all things that are sort of getting around the same sort of concept, but different ways of phrasing it. And so you'll have to keep playing around with those. And what they came up with is this, where they combine their search terms, their sets of search terms into a search string. So this whole thing is your search string. And when you contain a set of terms within a parentheses, it's going to treat that as one set of search terms. So when you run it through a, you know, if you think about mathematical equations, you do whatever's in the parentheses first. So in this case, if you didn't use parentheses, it would say peat or bog or whatever, and so it wouldn't take one of those terms and then in combination with the next set of terms and then the next, it would treat them as individual search sets. Okay. Okay, so just quick summary for you guys. So what I have put in the Google Drive link for you guys is an example of how a search string evolved and how we brainstormed some of these terminologies for a very big question with conservation and human well-being. And I believe if you go along the tabs in that, there should be other sheets in that thing. All right, let me just find this again. That show how we tested the search string. Oh, well, how do I find it? Can someone remind, what is that document called? Is it search string final? Okay. There we go. Okay. Okay, so you can see here in the beginning, you see how we've been able to, we call them tier 1 and tier 2, but you know, we were trying to think of all the possible terms we could use. And so we started with it pretty broad, saying like, okay, we're talking about conservation. So like, that's a very broad term. Okay, now how do we get more specific about conservation? What are the ways in which we talk about it? Okay, let's expand on that even further. What are more terms we might want to think about it? And then because we're using an established framework already of different types of conservation interventions, we were able to pull out those categories and say, okay, if we're talking about protection as a form of intervention, what are all the terms that go with intervention, with protection? We're talking about management of natural resources. What are all the terms and the ways you can talk about management of natural resources? And so you might want to think about that as you're going through your search development. And one of the things that I do want to mention that I think I alluded to earlier was people can talk about stuff in all different ways. But what you want to be able to do is, in order to make your review interpretable by a broad set of people, is be very clear about what you mean when you say protected area, or what you say, or what you mean when you say, you know, boundary object, for example, or knowledge translation. And if you adopt, and you can do that as a multiple way, you can define it. You can, if there's multiple categories that are going to go into it, you can adopt an existing typology, or you can synthesize a framework within which your review sits. So very clear framework of what are the intervention types that you're looking at, the outcome types that you're looking at, and what those definitions are and how you define them. And you know, that's where your review could get more complicated, maybe not necessarily more complicated, but take a little more time in the protocol development. And so it's not just about figuring out what your search terms are, but coming up with a typology of what the framing is in order to make sure that people understand what you're talking about. And so in some ways you might have to do a little bit of scoping or a scoping review to get to those elements to help you better define your research question and what that policy relevant framework ends up being. But if you look in that Excel document, you can see that you can see what our categories of outcomes are that we're looking at and all the different types of synonyms that we are thinking of or components that would fall into those. And when we talk about physical health, what are all different ways we talk about physical health? And you can see it then as well, how we start to, I don't know why, let me scroll. You can see as well here how we start to combine them. Where you see at the beginning it says title abs key. This is the identifier for different databases. And it'll tell you when you go into a database, if you want to search just title, abstracts, and keywords, what sort of header you need to put in front of it. So it'll say it's something like for Web of Science, it's TS equals, and then your search string. For Scopus, it's title abs key, and then the parentheses. So you'll have to modify the different parts of your search string depending on which database you're looking at. But this part of your search string should remain the same. And just one last thing for you guys, as you're starting to develop your search terms, I can't get this to go. As you're starting to develop your search terms, you are gonna need to create this sort of Boolean string. And one way you can do that is using Colander. So this is, remember where I brought up your search terms? So as you add terms to this and different synonyms, it will, so for example, if I want to say chair, and synonyms for chair, seat, stool, armchair, couch, thank you. And then the group that we're associating this term, this is our population, sure. And you press save. Oh, and it logged me out. Okay. Back. Oh, do that again. Seat, stool, chair, couch. Population. That's not yourself. Okay. So you'll see here that it's started to form your search query for you. And if you add another set of key terms, like upholstery. Apparently I'm thinking only about upholstering chairs today. Tweed, this. And this is your exposure. You'll see now it's created a search string for you, where you're connecting your different sets of terms that fall within the same group together with ORs, and then connecting those sets of terms together with ANDs. So this is nice. So as you start to change what your words are, you can update it here, and you're not constantly trying to readjust it in some document. So then if multiple people are searching different sources, they have one common search string.
It's going to let you delete because mine.
Huh? It won't let you?
It won't let me delete the term.
Yes. It will not let you delete a group of terms.
So what's the minus?
It's supposed to.
Oh.
It just broke. It deleted terms for a while, and then we don't know why, but it just all of a sudden stopped working. And you know, for those on the phone, and maybe everyone else, so the way that we built Colander was with a group of data science volunteers, and they were fantastic. The initial contract was that it would take like 4 to 6 months or something to build this tool, and 18 months later, they were still doing it. They were volunteers. They had full-time jobs. Caitlin, who's the code lead on this with me, and we now run it essentially as best as we can. She likes to tell people that in the time it took to build Colander, all 4 of the team moved cities, got new jobs, and all got married or engaged. So you can see that it took a while. So we had to let them go after a while. So if you find random stuff that doesn't work, just let me know, because we're doing another round of development soon after some fundraising. But things like if you make a mistake in typing in these terms, you can't delete a set of terms, but you can remove all the contents, and so it'll just show up as little blinks in your search string. You can remove them. But what you can do is if you were like, I don't want to talk about leather chairs anymore, and press save, this would change it, and it would change it here. But what you can't do is just delete like this whole line of stuff. All right, cool. So I know I would say I want to keep you guys until 12, so I'm going to stop, but I am happy to stick around for questions.
I just had one really quick question. On one of the tabs in that spreadsheet, what is the difference between the search terms that are in italics and the ones that aren't? Does that mean anything?
Yes. So here, so you're talking about like here?
Yeah.
So this was basically us saying, okay, this was our way of saying like this came from the previous tier and like a hierarchical searching structure. And this was just, okay, we're taking national park and reserve and protected area. What are all the different ways we can talk about it? The ones highlighted in green are the ones that are important to look at. These are the ones that we ended up using. Or so we ended up using. I don't think this is an updated document. But you can keep record of that in any way makes most sense to your team. So when you look at the evolution of the search string, you can see here where I've indicated hits, and then what I did to, like why the search string was different from the one above. So this one I was just searching human well-being and conservation, and we got this many, and then when I expanded it to be well or well-being or well-being or well-being, we got a lot more hits. And so you can sort of keep track of which terms are adding how many search results and which ones might be less useful. So for example, searching like law or policy usually ends up turning up a whole bunch of stuff. Sometimes searching just conservation is not very useful because it starts up about like conserving, what a lot of museum conservation comes up about artwork. What else? There's like conservation of different metabolic processes. That's apparently also a thing that's happening. So you want to be really clear about how you're choosing your terms, and you sort of want to scan through those initial search results as you add terms and delete terms and see what comes up and what may or may not be useful for you. But yeah.
Cool.
Any more questions? I think what we'll aim to do. Willow, what's your timeline for the summer? What are you guys planning?
It is in progress. We're still finalizing things, so.
Okay. So maybe just let me know when you guys have sort of gotten to what you might want to, if you want to get to searching by the end of the summer, if you want to get to, determine your inclusion and exclusion protocol by the end of the summer, let me know, because I think from this point forward, I'll be splitting trainings at different times depending on when people are in their projects. So like, we're going to have to talk about data extraction sooner rather than later. Like, we're going to talk about screening sooner than later, and searching, or all those things have to happen sooner. And like, Sarah, we're also have to talk about the whole scoping and screening, or scoping and searching and stuff over the next couple of weeks. But I think for you guys, maybe you're going to be developing your questions and taking a bit more time on that as a team. So just let me know what happens. ASU team will keep talking. We'll have meetings not next week, but the week after. Yeah. Cool. Actually, I could talk next week on the phone. On the phone. Cool. And then phone friends, any more questions?
Nope.
Cool.
So thank you.
Yeah, I hope this was helpful. I am going to, I can keep sharing resources with you guys over email, or if you have a folder you want me to dump them in, I can also do that. Just let me know.
Awesome. Sounds great. I'll make a a Google folder and I'll share it with you, Sam.
Sounds good. Okay.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Have a
Bye.
good weekend. Have fun.